Professor Marandi, let me bring you up for. We know that the supreme leader of Iran recently said that if we compromise on the nuclear program of Iran, they're going to talk about the missile program. They're going to talk about the human rights, free speech, all of that. This is little by little coming to the getting closer to to do regime change in Iran, so-called regime change in Iran. In your opinion, with what's going on, we've learned that Netanyahu is asking Donald Trump to bomb Iran. How do you find it? Do you think it's some sort of new rhetoric? Because when you look at the basically those media who are influenced by the Israeli government, who are trying to put everything, Israel gonna attack Iran any moment. What is your take on what's happening?
I don't think that the Israeli regime would attack Iran if it was thinking reasonably,
Mm.
because ultimately Iran would come out on top. And the best chance that they actually had was during the 12-day war when they carried out that blitzkrieg attack. Now Iran is much more prepared. Iran is working on its intelligence gathering, internal security, and its anti-drone capabilities have improved extensively. Anti-air defenses, meaning against aircraft, is something that they're working on. Of course, it takes a lot more time and a lot more work to get where they want. But when it comes to missiles, I think that the Iranians are expanding their underground bases, and also I think that they're also expanding, from what I hear. I don't know this from any uh, source inside the government, but from what I'm hearing online, is that they've expanded the range of their missiles, and I think that means that they will be launching also missiles from the east of Iran, which will make it much more difficult for the Israeli regime or the Americans, because they'd have to fly much further westwards or northwards to be able to target any of these places. So if there's another war, I think that it will be much worse for the Israeli regime. But the problem with Netanyahu and his fanatical allies is that their needs are not necessarily the needs of the Israeli regime. I personally, while in the West it is often said that the Israelis have won their wars, I think that the Israelis have really been the biggest losers in all this. The only place where they had any real success was when Netanyahu and Erdogan and Biden together overthrew the Syrian government. That was a major success. But in Lebanon, I don't see them achieving any victory. In Yemen, they were definitely defeated. In Iraq, they've not been able to do anything. Just, I think, yesterday, a senior official from Hamas, or a delegation from Hamas, went to Iraq and met one of the Popular Mobilization Forces lead commanders and thanked them for their support. Iraq today is in a stronger position to support the Palestinians than it was before the elections, because the pro-resistance factions increased their seats considerably, and they'll probably be a decisive voice in choosing the cabinet and the prime minister. So I don't see, I mean, in the war with Iran, the Israelis, I think it's clear that they failed. So I don't see this another war as being something that will benefit the regime. I think it'll be worse. But I think Netanyahu, his calculations are more about Netanyahu, and the calculations of his wife are more about her own needs. And she, of course, has huge influence on Netanyahu. So there is a possibility that they would attack. But I think um, it won't go well. If the Americans get involved, uh, you know, things will get out of control. We saw that the Americans carried out a limited strike on Iran, and the Iranians struck back, struck their base in Qatar, destroyed their radar systems, costing probably billions of dollars. But if the Americans want to get seriously involved, then I have no doubt, and I've said this many times before, that the Iranians will take out everything in the Persian Gulf because American bases are on all of these countries. So that would bring down the global economy, and it would be a catastrophe for all. But it's Iran's that would be Iran's response to some a war waged by the United States. So no matter how I look at it, it's not logical for the regime to attack, but that doesn't mean it won't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Larry, your take on that?
Well, no, I agree with the professor. Um, you've got this disconnect between the rhetoric and the actual military capability. So as we saw with what happened in the Red Sea with the Houthis, you know, Trump's basic line was, "Man, that Biden administration, they're a bunch of wimps. We're gonna show these Houthis who's the boss." So, what do they find out? Well, uh, those Houthis are tough little bastards. Man, you can't. Everything we tried to do to weaken and destroy them, they just kept coming back. It's like the Energizer Bunny. And but boy, were they able to step up the rate of taking down these predator drones. Previously they were shooting down about, one a month. Well, they upped it to about one a week. And at, $35 million a piece, that's pretty expensive. Um, and then the threats that were presented to the U.S. ships. So, the U.S. had to withdraw. What strikes me, and I'd be interested in what the professor is seeing, is the sort of the culmination of pressure, economic pressure on Iran came to a head back in 2015 with the signing of the JCPOA. Because at that time, both China and Russia were going with the West. Yeah, let's put that pressure on these Iranians. Now, where are we? Well, with the snapback sanctions, and I still don't understand why they call them snapback, because my understanding is they never took them off. How can you snap something back that's still been there all along? That's the first absurdity. But now both Russia and China are fed up with all the nonsense and the threats and the bullying coming out of Washington and out of Europe. Um, so when that snapback were announced, Russia and China both made a point. We're not doing this anymore. So I view that created an economic opening now for Iran that didn't exist 2 years ago, and that now they've got the collaboration with both Russian and Chinese, and I think even India, that there's sort of an economic light at the end of the tunnel for Iran that didn't exist 2 years ago. And so all of this attempt by the West to use its economic might to pressure Iran they're finding out that that power has eroded. And I think if you could get Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin off to the side and have a private chat, that they'd both be probably pretty surprised as well that has turned out this way, that their efforts to try to break free of Western hegemony, and particularly in the economic realm, it's actually starting to work. And it's working in a way that is actually terrifying the West. So um, I think we've got to recognize also the fundamental change that took place in Iran in the aftermath. On June 25th, after the 12-day war ended, that previous efforts by the Iranian leadership um, to keep the Russians and Chinese at arm's length, that went away. they've they've been there's a number of Iranian officials, both with the foreign ministry and defense ministry. They've been racking up some frequent flyer miles, getting back and forth to Moscow and to Beijing. So I'd be interested, Professor, what your observations have been.
Yeah, I think. you're absolutely correct that the difference between now and 2015 is enormous. Back then, Russia and China were much weaker countries.
Hmm.
Russia was uh, recovering in the middle of its growth, but it still hadn't got where where it is today. And the Russians and the Chinese weren't facing sanctions. So working with Iran would have been costly, and pressure from the United States was also costly. So what the Russians and the Chinese would do at the UN Security Council was that they'd water down the sanctions or the UN Security Council resolutions, but they wouldn't stand up against the United States. That gradually began to change, but I think the biggest shift took place after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, because the divide between the Russians and the West became enormous, and so the Iranians and the Russians moved much closer. And of course, we know that um, Iranian, from Western accounts, let's say, Iranian drones have played a very important role in the war between uh, the proxy war between NATO and Russia. And so the relationship began to improve much more rapidly. The same is true with China, especially after President Raisi came to power. Iran, he traveled both to Moscow, he traveled to Beijing, and also Iran joined BRICS as well as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So um, under his presidency, Iran began to decrease the focus on the West and focus more on the global South, Russia, China, and major powers in the global majority. Militarily, that's true as well. I think that the Iranians and the Russians today are working closer. The Iranians and the Chinese are working closer. The I think the 12-day war has also been something of concern to the Chinese. After the 12-day war, they are more invested in containing the United States, just like in Ukraine. The Chinese know that, and so do the Iranians. They know that if the Russians fail in Ukraine, then NATO will advance.
Yeah.
In the case of Iran, it will literally advance next door, because alongside Ukraine, they wanted to have Georgia in Ukraine as well, and then after Georgia would be Armenia and Azerbaijan. So Russian failure for Iran was not
Yeah.
acceptable. For the Chinese, not acceptable, because the Chinese knew that at the end of the day, the number one priority and the number one enemy for Western elites is China. So China began to tilt closer towards Iran even more after the 12-day war. In a sense, over the last few years, the United States and the Europeans have been very successful in pushing different countries together.
Yeah.
And Iran, Russia, China, among others, are among those countries. The same is true with India. The United States has been cultivating the relationship with India for many decades, for at least a couple of decades, and now all of a sudden, uh, the behavior of the United States has pushed India towards Russia, towards China, and obviously Iran would benefit from this as well. We saw the images of uh, the, the the Indian Prime Minister and the Russian and Chinese presidents smiling together in China. So I think that today it's much different. Iran after President Raisi became the president began to sell its oil. Under the previous administration, the Rouhani administration, Iran was selling very little oil. So Iran began to sell its oil at discounted prices. Gradually, its exports grew, the discounts decreased. And then by the time he passed away in the helicopter crash, Iran was selling all of its oil. It was at full capacity and no longer giving any major discounts. Now Iran's under the Pezeshkian administration. This is continuing. In fact, Iran's oil production is growing, and we're seeing the beginning of something very important in Iran, very important, which is not being discussed, and that is energy reforms. Iran is giving huge subsidies for gasoline and electricity and natural gas. So, for example, in Iran, gasoline is roughly 1 cent a liter, which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
But of course, it causes excess consumption. It de-incentivizes people to conserve, and also it creates a huge incentive for smuggling. Now the government is beginning to reform that and decrease the subsidy. It's still dirt cheap, but this is the beginning of a process. And if they continue down this road, then Iran's the government will be able to spend a lot more money on developing the country rather than spending it on subsidies. So this is a difficult time for Iran, but the world is in transition. Iran is selling its oil. Iran has trading partners. A decade ago, during the JCPOA, as Larry was alluding to, Iran was very isolated. The Russians were afraid to touch Iran. Companies were afraid to work with Iran. The same is true with China. But now, after the trade war and after the 12-day war, the Chinese think very differently. The Russians, of course, they're sanctioned like Iran, so neither side really cares what the West thinks. And Russian oil companies, which the Americans are forcing out of other countries, now they're investing in Iran. So 2, 3, 4 years down the road, with the north-south transport corridor completed, you're going to see Iran as a hub for Russian oil and gas, most probably gradually. Uh, Russian exports and imports will go through Iran, Russian oil and gas investments, and more increasingly Chinese investments. So it won't the situation in Iran won't change tomorrow, but I think 2, 3, 4 years down the road, as the U.S. continues to decline and the global South becomes more assertive, I think the impact of U.S. sanctions, as Larry has alluded to, which is already melting, it will melt even much further.